All right, are you ready? We're diving into a big question today. Does God still speak to us?
Ooh, that's a good one.
It is, right? And we're going to look at this article by Dr. Roy called Does God Still Speak to Man? And it's really got me thinking.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that's been around for centuries,
Yeah,
but it feels especially relevant now.
it does. And so to get started, Dr. Roy, he tells the story about a young man in Tennessee, and this young man's pastor told him straight up that God's gone silent.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. No more direct conversations,
Right.
only the Bible and church leaders, they've got the hotline to God. Can you imagine being told that?
Yeah, it really makes you think about who we believe has that authority,
Mm.
to interpret the divine.
Right. Yeah.
Dr. Roy obviously disagrees. He's convinced that God is still talking.
Mm.
We've just got to cut through all the noise to hear him.
And so to hear him, he compares it to tuning a radio dial.
Uh-huh.
We need to find God's frequency amongst all the static.
I like that.
It's a good one, right?
Yeah.
And get this, Dr. Roy. He went all in. Like, he earned master's degrees in theology and biblical counseling to really understand the debate.
Wow.
And what's wild is that he found many theologians, who believed in the Trinity doctrine weren't so sure about humans just like, casually chatting with God.
That's so interesting. It's like, the way we view God, whether he's distant or close, personal or impersonal, that totally shapes how we try to listen for his voice.
Totally.
If we think he's way out there beyond reach, why would we even bother?
Exactly.
Right.
And Dr. Roy, he admits that, he was once in that boat too,
Yeah.
just totally consumed by life, by the hustle and bustle. And it wasn't until he really learned to quiet his mind that he realized, whoa, God's been whispering this whole time.
It makes you wonder, if God is speaking, does everyone have the potential to hear?
Right.
Are some folks just better receivers? And if everyone can hear God, I mean, what does that mean for organized religion as we know it?
Do we even need intermediaries if we can all just go straight to the source? Okay, but before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's look at how Dr. Roy says God might speak. And he uses the story of the prophet Elijah, who finds God not in the dramatic wind or earthquake, but in a still small voice. Remember that one?
Yeah, it's so powerful.
It is.
It completely flips the script.
Yeah.
On that booming, judgmental God.
Right, like in the Ten Commandments movie.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We almost expect that earth-shattering voice from the heavens,
Yeah.
when it might actually be more like a quiet nudge,
Yeah.
an intuition,
Just knowing.
that feeling you just know what to do.
Totally. It's like we're bracing ourselves for this thunderstorm, and God's trying to send us a text message.
Exactly.
So speaking of that inner knowing, Dr. Roy, he gets pretty deep with the idea of the temple of God being inside each of us,
Uh-huh.
not just some building. He even quotes the Apostle Paul, who said, "Don't you realize that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit?"
It's such a radical concept when you really think about it.
It is. It is. And Dr. Roy takes it even further. He uses this awesome visual of God's train filling the temple. He's saying that all of God, his fullness, his power, is within us.
Well, so not only is there a temple inside us, but it's packed to the rafters with divine potential.
It is.
Wow. And that challenges this idea that we need to go searching for God out there in the world,
Right.
when really we already have everything we need within.
So what does having all of God within us actually mean for, say, your everyday life? How does this change how we pray or how we make decisions or interact with others?
That's where it gets really fascinating.
Yeah.
If we're not just vessels for God's will, but we actually contain his essence,
Yeah.
what responsibility does that place on us?
And how do we tap into that power without feeling like totally overwhelmed? I mean, this is where I start thinking about, those folks who claim to have those like direct,
Yeah.
Burning bush conversations with God. Like, is that the norm? Or is there a quieter, more subtle way God might be communicating with us all the time? I'm definitely curious to hear more about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how do we know, that we're not just fooling ourselves? How do we tell the difference between, divine inspiration and just some random thought that pops into our head?
Well, that's where Dr. Roy really gets into this idea of discernment. That ability to distinguish between, truth and illusion,
Yeah.
divine guidance, and just our own ego's chatter.
Mm.
And he actually uses the story of Paul and the shipwreck again
Oh, yeah.
to illustrate this. Remember how everyone on board heard Paul's warnings about the storm,
Uh-huh.
But they didn't really listen until it was almost too late.
They heard the words, but they didn't let it sink in. They didn't connect to the deeper meaning.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's where the idea of this living word comes in.
Okay.
And Dr. Roy contrasts this with, the static written word of the Bible, which he sees as the foundation, but not the whole story. This living word is this dynamic, personal message from God that brings the scriptures alive with fresh meaning. It's like a personal letter from a friend.
So it's this personal message. He calls this the Rima word.
Yes.
And he gives this great example of a couple on the verge of divorce, and they're praying super loudly, almost demanding that God step in and fix everything.
Yeah, which, let's be honest, I think that's how a lot of us approach prayer.
Uh-huh.
We come to God with this laundry list of demands, and we expect him to, wave a magic wand and just make it all better.
Exactly.
But what if prayer is less about dictating to God and more about creating that space for quiet listening?
Yeah.
Allowing that divine wisdom to kind of seep into our hearts.
It's like we're trying to shout over God instead of letting him whisper in our ear.
Exactly, yeah.
Makes me wonder if part of the problem is we have this preconceived notion of what God's voice should sound like. We might be expecting this booming voice from the heavens when it's actually, like a gentle nudge, a gut feeling, or just a sudden flash of insight.
A knowing.
Yeah. Dr. Roy, he talks about how he learned from all these teachers with wildly opposing views, which forced him to develop his own internal compass. He didn't just blindly accept everything he was told. He questioned, analyzed, compared different perspectives.
So it's like we become our own, spiritual fact checkers.
It is.
Yeah. We
Yes.
can't just passively consume whatever we hear or read. We have to actively engage with it,
Right.
weigh the evidence, and see how it resonates with our own experiences and intuition.
That takes courage, though.
It does.
Right. I mean, it's much easier to just go along with what everyone else is saying, especially when it comes to religion.
Yeah.
But Dr. Roy seems to be saying that true spiritual growth involves developing that independent discernment,
Absolutely.
even if it means challenging, some long-held beliefs.
It's not saying to throw out tradition altogether,
No.
but it's approaching it with, a curious and discerning mind.
Yeah.
Always asking, does this resonate with me? Does this align with my understanding of God?
Yeah. And I love how he doesn't shy away from talking about the roadblocks to hearing God.
Yeah.
He lists things like fear, distraction, impatience, even clinging to false prophets. It's almost like a checklist of what not to do if
Okay.
you want to, tune in.
Yeah, and those obstacles are even, I feel like, amplified in today's world.
Yeah.
We're constantly bombarded with these messages that trigger fear and anxiety.
Really.
Keep us distracted, keep us glued to our screens.
Right. And with the rise of all these social media influencers,
Yeah,
it's harder than ever to discern who to trust, even in the spiritual realm.
absolutely.
So amidst all this noise and chaos, how do we actually create that space for quiet listening? What are some practical steps that we can take to clear the way?
Well, Dr. Roy suggests things like meditation, gratitude, surrounding ourselves with positive influences. It's about cultivating that inner environment where that still small voice can actually be heard.
And maybe hitting that unfollow button on all those accounts that make you feel stressed or inadequate.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Taking a break from social media, creating space for silence and reflection, it seems so crucial, in this world where we're constantly connected.
Yeah.
It's about shifting our focus from that external noise to those, internal whispers.
The whispers of our hearts.
Yes.
Okay, but what about those times when it feels like, we're praying and we're getting radio silence?
Yeah.
What if we're listening, but God's not speaking?
Well, and that's the question I think that we all wrestle with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what Dr. Roy would say is maybe the problem isn't that God isn't speaking.
Yeah.
Maybe it's that we're not recognizing the ways that he is communicating. Maybe we're expecting a grand pronouncement when it's actually a subtle nudge. Or maybe we're just misinterpreting the message altogether.
It's like we're expecting an email when God sent a handwritten letter. Or maybe he's trying to reach us through a song or a conversation or even a chance encounter.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. It's about being open to the unexpected,
Yeah. Yeah.
recognizing those divine fingerprints in those seemingly ordinary moments.
So it's less about mastering a specific formula and more about cultivating a receptive heart.
Absolutely, yeah.
Willingness to be surprised by God.
Yes, and that requires a certain level of trust,
It does.
right? Trust that even when we don't feel anything or hear anything,
Uh-huh.
God is still working behind the scenes,
Okay.
orchestrating events and guiding us toward our highest good.
That's a comforting thought, especially when, like, life feels so chaotic and uncertain.
Yeah.
But how do we develop that trust when it feels like, we're just walking through a fog?
That's where faith comes in.
Okay.
Not blind faith, but a faith grounded in experience.
Yeah.
In those moments when we look back and recognize the ways that God has been working in our lives,
Uh-huh.
even when we're completely unaware of it.
So it's about paying attention to, like, the patterns,
Yes.
the synchronicities,
Yes.
the coincidences that might actually be, divine whispers.
Yes, exactly.
Guiding us along.
And recognizing that sometimes God's answer isn't this booming yes or no,
Right.
but it's a gentle nudge in a certain direction.
Mm-hmm.
A door opening here, another one closing over there. It's about trusting the process,
Yeah.
even when we don't, understand the whole picture.
Okay, I'm starting to get this. It's less about demanding answers and more about surrendering to the mystery.
Yes.
Trusting that even in the silence, God is present and working things out for our good.
Beautifully said.
But how do we avoid, like, falling into the trap of just making stuff up?
Right.
Attributing, every random thought to divine inspiration.
Well, I think that's where discernment comes back into play.
Okay.
It's about developing that internal compass,
Yeah.
that ability to check in with our intuition and say, does this feel aligned with my values,
Okay.
with my understanding of God, with the teachings of my faith?
So it's not just about, like, feeling good, but also about aligning with a deeper sense of truth and wisdom.
Exactly. And that's a lifelong process,
Yeah.
It's about constantly learning, questioning, and refining our understanding of what it means to be in conversation with the divine.
And maybe being willing to admit when we're not sure.
Yes.
And just sit with the questions
Yes.
and trust that, the answers will reveal themselves.
That's a great point. Sometimes that silence is an invitation to go deeper, to explore different perspectives,
Yeah.
allow our understanding to evolve.
Totally.
It's not about having all the answers.
No.
It's about embracing the mystery and trusting the journey.
Now, this is where things get a little more symbolic. Dr. Roy uses biblical names and places to, like, represent different spiritual states. For instance, he points to Bala, it's a place in Palestine, as symbol of, like, trembling and exhaustion from fear.
Wow.
Yeah, and then Osni represents, like, a receptive ear for truth.
I like that one.
Right,
Yeah.
and then Kalaya signifies the power of spiritual inspiration,
Mm-hmm.
like that ability to articulate divine truth.
Wow, it's like he's adding this other layer of meaning to the Bible, encouraging us to see these stories not just as historical events, but as metaphors for our own inner journey.
Yeah, it's almost like a secret code to unlock these deeper spiritual truths.
I like that.
It is.
Yeah.
It makes you want to go back and reread those stories with fresh eyes. But it also raises questions like, why do you think he focuses on this kind of symbolism? What's he hoping to achieve by highlighting, these hidden meanings?
That is a great question. And it leads us to this even bigger discussion,
Yeah.
about the nature of interpretation.
Uh-huh.
Is there one right way to understand the Bible?
Mm-hmm.
Or are there multiple layers of meaning, just waiting to be uncovered?
Right. And how do we balance respecting those traditional interpretations with finding our own personal connection to these ancient texts?
Right.
It's a fascinating challenge. And I think, it's one that we all face as we try to make sense of our own spiritual experiences.
Absolutely. And maybe that's the beauty of it all.
Yeah.
The journey of faith isn't about finding all the answers.
No.
It's about embracing the questions, the mysteries,
Yeah.
and the constant evolution of our understanding.
I love that. Wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from, like,
Yeah.
wrestling with whether God still speaks to exploring, how we might actually tune in. It's been quite a journey. What's really sticking with you from all this?
What keeps coming back to me is that image, that Dr. Roy uses of God's train
Oh, yeah.
filling the temple within us. It's just such a powerful visual, for that idea that we're not just empty vessels waiting to be filled, but we actually contain, like, the fullness of God.
It's like we're walking around with a direct connection to the divine,
Right.
but we just forget to plug in.
Exactly.
But if that's true, then what does that mean for how we live our lives?
Right. Like, it's not just about passively receiving these messages. It's about actively embodying that divine presence in everything we do.
So it makes me think about all those biblical figures who, were considered prophets or messengers. Like, were they just ordinary people
Yes.
who learned to tap into that divine frequency
Right.
and then they had the courage to act on it?
It makes you wonder.
It does. It takes us right back to that young man in Tennessee, whose pastor insisted that God only speaks through the Bible or church leaders.
Right.
What if instead, that young man and all of us really could be these conduits for divine communication?
That's a powerful shift in perspective.
It is. It challenges that whole idea that spirituality is about following this set of rules or relying on these external authorities.
Right.
Instead, each of us has the potential to be a messenger, to share the light and love that we've received with the world.
It's a beautiful thought,
Yeah,
but it also puts a lot of responsibility on us, doesn't it?
it does.
If we're not just, waiting for instructions, but we're actively listening and then acting on it.
The stakes are higher.
Yeah.
They are.
It's exhilarating and a little daunting, right?
It is.
Thinking that our choices, our actions, could be part of something so much bigger than ourselves.
So it requires us to really step up, be discerning, and trust our intuition.
Absolutely.
So it's not just about hearing the message. It's about having the courage to live it out in the world. But what if we mess up? What if we think we're hearing God, but we're wrong?
Oh, yeah. I think that's a valid fear.
It is.
But, I think Dr. Roy would say that making mistakes is part of the process.
Yeah.
It's through those experiences, through learning and growing,
Yeah.
that we refine our ability to discern
Mm.
and become more attuned to those subtle whispers of guidance.
So maybe it's not about being perfect, but about being willing to take risks, to step outside of our comfort zones and just trust that even when we stumble, we're still being guided and supported.
Yes, and that's where faith comes in.
Right.
Not blind faith, but a trust that's built on experience.
Mm-hmm.
Those moments when we look back and we see how God has been working in our lives,
Yeah.
even when we weren't aware of it.
It's like looking back at a tapestry and finally seeing those intricate patterns, those threads that connect all those seemingly random events into this meaningful whole.
Yes.
But that requires us to pay attention,
Right.
be present, notice those synchronicities and those, coincidences that might actually be those divine whispers.
Exactly. And recognizing that sometimes God's answer isn't that booming yes or no.
Right.
But it's that gentle nudge in a certain direction.
Uh-huh.
Like a door opening here
Yeah.
and another closing over there.
It's about trusting the process, even
Yeah.
when we don't have all the answers.
Yes.
Knowing that even in the silence, even in the midst of all that uncertainty, God is present and working things out for our good.
That's beautifully said.
Yeah.
And it leaves us with this sense of hope and possibility.
Uh-huh.
Maybe God is speaking constantly in a million different ways.
Maybe he is.
Maybe he's whispering guidance, offering inspiration, nudging us toward our purpose.
Yeah.
And maybe, just maybe, we have the power to not only hear, but to respond,
Yes.
to become messengers of that love and light in a world that, desperately needs it.
So as you go about your day, as you face challenges and make decisions, I invite you to just ask yourself, what if God is speaking? What if he's right here, right now, whispering in your heart? And what if you have the power to listen, to act, to become a beacon of his love in the world?
Beautiful.
Keep listening, keep exploring, and keep believing in the power of the divine within you.